Hello, everybody. This background is not customary, but for some reason, my StreamYard software was not getting picked up by my camera. It was showing a blank, even though I know StreamYard, is working. But my software, which is actually XSplit VCam, wasn't properly working. I have no idea why. There was an update just recently, and I think the update must have thrown everything off. I probably have to recalibrate it. Anyway, we'll just have to get along without the background tonight. So let me say hello. Hello, Dolores. Hello, Steve Gonzo. Yeah, Firestone chat. And Kay says, hi, everybody. Glad to see you. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi. Hiya, Steve. Great to see you. And Dolores Pierce says, good evening, everyone. And Amber says, hello, my lovelies. How are you, Amber? Glad to see you. I think Amber is our representative from Hull, Washington, who's here tonight. So, let's continue to review the thread. Where we left off yesterday with this thread, and let's hope I can get it, was with Georgia, that is at George Davenport's reply to Jules' 1971 and Red Berets, M for All, and 21 others. Georgia says, you know what's interesting? You hopped onto a thread about a single-payer author. Is this where I left off? Forgive me. I don't think I quite left off there. I left off a lot before that, and I'd be missing a lot of good stuff if I picked it up there. So excuse me. I think I left it off where Georgia suggested that Canada was a very good empirical example of how things went. But let me get there, just scrolling up. Sorry I didn't stage this properly. I lost the place in the thread. Here. So Jules said, yes, I found that myself too. Where's the previously mentioned analysis of the rollout of state-by-state Medicare for all, proving that it's a workable option? I don't see that. George replied, I think the real-life example of Canada passing this province by province is a good one. So Georgia cited that as a real-world example. And the Red Berets, M for All, hashtag I1362, said, I think the real-life example of my sister's life being saved 2 times by the Canadian system because Tommy Douglas and many determined people of Saskatchewan province fought for the human right to health care. Now it's been over 50 years that Canadian lives have been placed before profit. Healthcare is a human right. And pictures of the Red Berets, the Red Berets. Georgia replies and says, well, Laura, that's impossible. You see, your sister couldn't possibly have been saved by the Canadian healthcare system because provinces can't print their own money. That, of course, was a sarcastic reply to the MMTers. Andre Stackhouse replied, said, honestly, here's an idea. What if we reach out to Stephanie Kelton? We can learn a lot from MMT, and I think folks are trying their best to figure out how to apply those ideas to actual policy. I'm sure Kelton agrees that Medicare for All is easy to finance if we just issue new currency for it. Where she might but disagree is that this doesn't mean we should do nothing in cases where we can't. We still should be using the policy tools that we have available at all levels of government. I don't think Stephanie would actually disagree with this, Andre. Stephanie used to be my editor at the UMKC Economics blog. She was the one who recruited me to write for that blog, which I wrote for 3 years. And I think I know the tenor of her thought fairly well. And I think she would contend that we still should be using the policy tools we have available at all levels of government, as you put it, Andre. Oratoria says, what makes states a gray area is that they can't issue currency, but they can level taxes. So it's theoretically possible to use MMT principles to fund Medicare for All at the state level through taxation. The problem is it's only really feasible in states with lots of wealthy people to tax. Now, many people would disagree with Noratorius's comment here because it's demonstrable that a Medicare for All system, at least one at the national level, is likely to be far less expensive than is the current system we have. It is likely, in fact, to save perhaps as much as 1/3 or even more of total health care spending. The nations of Europe, which have, of course, extensive healthcare systems that are akin to Medicare for All, if not exactly the same as our Medicare for All proposal, but often allow these nations to get better outcomes than we have, and to spend only 8 or 9 or 10, or 11% of GDP, where we spend 18% of our GDP and are well on our way to making it 20%. CBO forecasts, or I should say, the CMS forecasts, or projections, are projecting that within 2 years we will be at 20%, of GDP. And Tommy, hashtag learn at MMT, hashtag FJG, hashtag native sovereignty back. Even then, it would only last for so long. Margaret Thatcher was only right when it comes to the state level, which is a currency user. She said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out, of other people's money. Except calling it socialism was inaccurate, right? So in other words, she wasn't really right, on any count, because in many, many states, at the state level, they most probably would be able to support a Medicare for All program. I mean, after all, how can they support one in France? How can they support one in Spain? How can they support a program like that, in Belgium? Denmark, by the way, is far smaller. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Denmark has a national health service. These countries, I mentioned, do not deficit spend on healthcare. They are not eventually running out of tax money. They are successfully taxing. I mean, that's an empirical fact. Just look over there and see. Yeah, there's lots of austerity in budgeting in those countries, and healthcare systems have suffered some from austerity during this time of troubles, okay, in Europe. However, they have maintained their healthcare systems. They have not run out of money for that. And I think they would disagree with you that it was other people's money. They might be taxing in order to get the money they need to spend. But I'm not sure that they would quite agree with Margaret Thatcher that the money that other people had been able to accumulate was their money and their money alone. They would especially not agree with that if they were socialists. Georgia replies, you're using Margaret Thatcher to bolster your arguments. I have to say this thread is getting wild with leftists quoting Thatcher. Even if we did, quote, run out, unquote, of Bezos, Gates, and the other 12 billionaire dollars here in Washington, would the thousands of lives saved be worth it, in your opinion? A very good point, Georgia. Tommy says, once you do run out at the state level, what about the millions or more lives lost? Because everyone thinks hashtag Medicare for all doesn't work because of what happened at the state level and therefore isn't implemented ever again. We would be right back where we started, but even worse. I think this is a good reply from Tommy, but of course it assumes that Medicare for all at the state level is doomed to fail. And I have to say again, why would it be doomed to fail in California, which has a population, if I'm not mistaken, of nearly 40 million people? Is that not so? There are nations with a lot less than 40 million people that are not running out of tax money to pay for their Medicare for all like systems. That's just not happening. There's no guarantee that a Medicare for all program would fail in California. Now, I'm well aware of the political arguments. I'm well aware that people say, okay, that Medicare for all was tried in Vermont. It wasn't tried in Vermont. That Medicare for all was tried in Colorado. No, it wasn't tried in Colorado. It was never implemented, okay, in Colorado. Because the Coloradans didn't want to go through with taxing people. They blinked. Vermont people blinked. Anyway, Vermont and Colorado are far smaller states, especially Vermont than California. How about a regional system with Washington, Oregon, and California coming together? How many people is that? 55 million people? 55 million people can easily support a Medicare for all system in which all spending for Medicare for all is paid for by tax revenue. They might have to have higher taxes, yes, but that doesn't mean that Medicare for all won't work. Georgia said this is incorrect and demonstrates you haven't looked at our funding mechanisms and transition plan. As someone who has spoken to thousands of voters about it, the part that they fear is change. Once they see the benefits of Medicare for all, like in other countries, they will fight to keep it. Tommy says, what are you going to do? Put a cage around your state and lock your funding mechanisms in? That is a very good point. That is a very good point. What happens if people begin to leave the state because the tax revenues collected are greater? Now, there's a reply to that. Let's go see if we see it. Scott Desnoyers, if that's the way you pronounce his name, says, first serious response, really? How are replies like this helping moving forward with either issue? Hashtag MMT or hashtag Medicare for all? Not so serious response. Have you ever been to Seattle? It's already caged in. There are miles of fence mazes around every building and parking lot. I don't think that response, Scott, was a real serious one because, okay, I think that what Tommy is saying is, how do you stop people from from leaving the state when they see the high taxes? I think this has to be discussed in detail. What would be the additional burden for Medicare for all? I believe that is costed out in Gerald Friedman's analysis. Okay, and I believe that, okay, if you want to ask the question, Tommy, what are you going to do? Put a cage around your state and lock your funding mechanisms in? I think if you're going to make a comment like that, it's incumbent upon you to look at Gerald Friedman's plan and see whether it's a viable plan or not. Now, it may not be a viable plan. It may assume funding, which looks like it's there now, but which doesn't take into account the likelihood that a certain number of people probably will move out of the state of California because perhaps taxes are a bit higher, if taxes are going to be a bit higher. But be prepared for the possibility that in Friedman's analysis, he points out that the amount of money saved by Medicare for all for the state of Washington is sufficient by itself to pay for Medicare for all, that the state won't be spending any more on health care than it's spending now. Be prepared for that possibility, Tommy says. That won't keep your funding mechanisms, aka billionaires, from hopping over to a nearby conservative state. And Tommy says, MMT shows we don't have to go to the capitalist murders who don't want Medicare for all to beg for funding to Medicare for all. Tommy, that's quite true. But that's true at the federal level. That's not true at the state level. And I don't think that Scott and the others are advocating for begging for funding for Medicare for all. They're advocating for taking the money through taxation. That used to be a way of doing things. And from time to time, it was effective. Before the United States became a monetary sovereign, we were funding expensive programs here through taxation, and people paid their taxes. Now, it's true we had cultural changes that were very damaging to that particular model. But during the New Deal period and during the post-New Deal period, but right up until the 1960s, people paid their taxes. Till the Kennedy administration, there were 90% income tax rates in this country. And the country did a lot better in terms of growth and prosperity than it's doing now. And a lot better when it came to employment, too. Georgia says the conservative states have income tax and wealth taxes. Even if our bill does pass, they would still be better off in Washington. We don't have an income tax. We have the most regressive tax system in the United States. Well, that's an interesting reply. It's a factual reply. I think George Davenport could have been more explicit by mentioning the conservative states that have the income tax, okay, and wealth taxes. And Tommy probably would have been better off had he mentioned which states the funding mechanisms are going to move to. he might be more explicit and indicate where Bill Gates's next mansion is going to be constructed, that he's going to live in after he moves out, of Washington, where Bezos is going to live. I think Bezos is already living in New York, isn't he? So he's moved out anyway. Anyway, Red Beret says so many facts that people forming premature opinions seem to be unaware of. Yes, that's true. Georgia says, yeah, it hurts me to see tweets like the one about Bezos leaving Washington get traction. This is misinformation being spread, and it bolsters the right-wing argument that we shouldn't tax billionaires because they'll just move. That's how Washington got so regressive in the first place. Georgia says, to review MMTers' arguments made in these threads, Thatcher was right. If we pass the progressive legislation, we will run out of dollars. Universal health care equals more taxes. If we tax billionaires, they'll move. Now, the U.S. isn't Canada. Leftists need to stop parroting right-wing talking points. Okay, Georgia, those arguments may have been made, by MMTers. They were made, by MMTers. But that doesn't mean that they are MMT arguments. In other words, that doesn't mean that those arguments are part of the MMT lens. Now, certain MMTers have made arguments that taxing is difficult. For example, that's a position often taken by Randy Ray, who will argue, don't be dependent on the taxes, of billionaires, because they have all kinds of ways, of avoiding taxes. It's very difficult to keep them taxed over time, And he may be right about that, but it's an empirical question. It isn't part of the MMT lens per se. Randy Ray says that, but there are many other MMTers who are not so pessimistic about getting. I'm not quite so pessimistic about the possibilities of offsetting large amounts of spending through taxation. The argument, that the U.S. isn't Canada might have been stated in summary by Tommy, but as I covered in the last of my live streams, when you look at that argument in detail, as Margaret Flowers has, I think she makes a good case, that the U.S. isn't Canada, and that even if Medicare for All were successful in the state of Washington, which I suspect it can be, I think it can be successful in that particular state, given the political culture of that state. It could be successful there, I think. But even if it is successful there, that may not at all guarantee a pattern of adoption of Medicare for All similar to Canada's. It's a different story. Tommy says, I'd like to stop this back and forth soon, but I must set the record straight. Thatcher was not right when it comes to the federal level. Congress will never run out of dollars, but states do. Universal health care can equal more taxes if done at the state level, more or below. Yes, Tommy, I think that's right. It can equal more taxes. It can also equal less taxes. I think it depends on the state and how well they manage it and how well they implement it, it can save a great deal of money. Again, there's Jerry Friedman's study saying that between $5 and $9 billion would be saved by a state-level Medicare for All plan. I'm not saying Jerry's right, but what I'm saying is there shouldn't be cavalier statements made that he's wrong without addressing his arguments in detail. He may very well be right that in the case of Washington, a state-level plan would save between $5 and $9 billion and therefore result in less taxes at the state level. Tommy says, if we tax billionaires at the state level in the hopes that it will fund Medicare for all, it isn't hard for them to move to another state. We don't need billionaires. We need the currency issuer for hashtag Medicare for all. We can tax the you-know-what out of billionaires to lessen inequality and for the fun of it. Yes, we can. But I'm not sure that whole Washington is saying that they will have enough money for state-level Medicare for all, but because they have a few billionaires to tax. They also have a lot of other fairly wealthy people who can be taxed, who may work for the billionaires, but who have to go into the office very frequently, and who, for one reason or another, are stationed in Seattle. They have to live in the state of Washington. They cannot move like Bezos can move, okay, or Gates can move, and that they will be there to be taxed is a reasonable assumption. It's not only billionaires who pay taxes. It's also many, many other wealthy people who pay taxes. And then Georgia says, I've answered this a few times. They would still have a better tax rate even if hours passed than if they moved to another state. Additionally, capital gains is just one part of our funding mechanism. Did you not see the response when I made it before? Tommy says, if that is the case, who else is getting taxed to pay for this? The working class? Georgia says, okay, again, right now people like me in Washington are paying a private healthcare tax. I can save money by instead paying that money, but less, since there will be no CEO skimming for their third yacht into a publicly funded system. See meme, as Alex Coach. Guys, if your taxes go up by $2,000 and your healthcare costs go down by $8,000, is that good or not? Yeah, I've made that argument myself in the national context. He says, I can't figure this out. Please help. Yep. If it looks like a good deal, it might be a good deal. But Tommy says, what is a private healthcare tax? Come on, Tommy, you know what he's talking about. He's saying that the money they're paying to a private health insurer is basically a private healthcare tax. Because right now, people have no choice. If they want health care, they have to pay a private healthcare tax, basically. Georgia says, the premiums, copays, and deductibles that come with private insurance, which is required in Washington State, or you get penalized. The individual mandate was passed as state law because it was repealed federally. Whoa. And Tommy says, but that isn't a tax, it's a fee. I looked it up and couldn't find anything about a private healthcare tax in the state of Washington. Tommy, come on. Functionally, for the people receiving it, it's the same. Georgia responds, calling it a tax or a fee is semantics. If we're forced to buy something because of law or necessity, but could instead pay into something more affordable that puts people's lives over profit, that's better This is the whole premise of Medicare for all in every other developed country. I thought the whole premise of Medicare for all was free health care because that is what I support. Okay. In other countries that are not monetary sovereigns, and even the countries that are monetary sovereigns, people are taxed to offset healthcare spending. In countries that are not monetary sovereigns, they are taxed to pay for healthcare spending because the tax revenues do pay for the healthcare spending there. So, in those countries, Medicare for all is not free healthcare. It is free at the point of service. Yes, and they pay less than we pay here for our healthcare, but it is not free healthcare. Georgia says there's no funding mechanisms in the U.S. For Medicare for all bill, but Bernie outlined a possible strategy. The mechanisms are very similar to what we have in our bill. Yeah, Bernie proposed a menu of financing options that would more than pay for Medicare for all in 2016. Tommy says taxes do not fund spending at the federal level. Georgia says, he wrote the damn bill and says he needs taxes to pay for it, so... And Tommy says, I love Bernie, but he doesn't know anything. Tommy, you know that Bernie knew that he didn't need taxes to pay for health care. By that time, he knew. Stephanie had been his advisor, for 3 years? At that point, she never explained to him that taxes do not fund spending at the federal level. He knew that. Bernie wasn't willing to educate the public about that. So he took the other route. He showed that there was a way to pay for Medicare for all, or if you want to put it in MMT terms, to offset Medicare for all spending with taxes at the federal level. He knew that, and so he proposed that because he wouldn't have to educate people about MMT. Now, I regret he made that particular decision. Between the runs in 2016 and 2020, Bernie had plenty of time to educate people about MMT. And I'm very sorry he didn't. I think it was a wrong strategic move on his part, and it hurt, us all. But you have to be honest about this. Bernie did justify Medicare for all at the federal level by saying that taxes would pay for it. Georgia replies and says, no one knows everything, but I'm guessing he knows a lot more than you or me about this particular subject. I'm willing to concede that. I'm the operations director for a universal healthcare campaign. I ran for legislature, and I'm a state committee member for the Washington Dems. You may be all those things, George Davenport. I'm not willing to concede that Bernie knows more than you about Medicare for all. Bernie knows a lot about Medicare for all, yes, and certainly he and his staff did write a pretty good bill, for Medicare for all, if we ignore the pay-for suggestions, and those things, But Bernie is not a specialist when it comes to Medicare for all, and there are people at the Physicians for a National Health Program who know more than Bernie about Medicare for all. That's just the truth. And you, as far as I know, may know more than Bernie about Medicare for all. Tommy says, well, he has learned from Stephanie Kelton, who was the chief economist for the Democratic minority staff of the Senate Budget Committee, but I think Bernie is afraid to speak the knowledge of MMT. Yes, Tommy, right. Now you're being honest. Well, maybe all should address the potential funding issues with his bill before coming after groups who are working hard for both national and state efforts. All I know is we are replicating successful systems using progressive funding mechanisms that will save lives. And so Red Beret says, wasn't MMT going to fund the JAWS program transition plan? And when did healthcare become free? It needs to be paid for, and in whole Washington's plan it is, and it will save billions every year. And we have I think you meant to say a transition plan there, Red Berets. And he said traffic to Holly was terrible at George Davenport, one of two. And James Nicholas said, if you don't understand MMT, and you don't, it's best to make an effort to do so before opining about it. Healthcare didn't become free, but it can and will. Congressional appropriation is how it will be funded, period. Okay, Jim. The fact remains that at the federal level, healthcare spending is not paid for by taxes. So, in that sense, federal healthcare spending is free in that particular sense. It's not funded by taxes. But of course, we know that there are offsets. People pretend it's funded by taxes, and so they offset healthcare spending dollar for dollar. That's what they do. They have congressional appropriations, and they appropriate spending, and by the way, they appropriate taxes. Taxes are an appropriation too. They are an appropriation bill. And are you being served? Hashtag Red Berets says, where's your bill? That's at 50 lines only. Where's your bill? James says, it's out there and has been since Connors first introduced it. That has nothing to do with my comment. Yes, Connors first introduced it, if I'm not mistaken, in 2003. But that was H.R. 676. The current bill at the federal level is H.R. 1976, which is Pramila Jayapal's bill. And by the way, Jayapal's bill, Jayapal, of course, comes from the state of Washington herself, and if I recall, served in the legislature of the state of Washington. And undoubtedly, whole Washington's bill owes considerable to the, as Georgia says, the Conyers bill. Now Jayapal's, no. Jayapal's bill is different from the Conyers bill. It funds more things. I shouldn't say it funds. It specifies more benefits than Conyers bill does. It's more explicit than Conyers bill was. It's more binding in a sense than Conyers bill would have been had it been passed. It is an improvement over Conyers bill. Now, Bernie's bill is not an improvement. I mean, it's an improvement over Conyers bill, not an improvement over Jayapal's bill. It's not as good a bill, as Jayapal's. Has a longer transition period. It's not as good when it comes to nursing home benefits. No, Georgia, Bernie's bill will not be funded by taxes because at the federal level, nothing is funded but by taxes. What happens is they do offsets and pretend it's being funded by taxes, except in the case of some of them, they're not pretending, they don't know the difference. They don't know why we say the taxes do not fund spending. But this is in an old article Stephanie Kelton originally published in 1998. It's a classic article pointing out The taxes and bonds do not finance federal spending. You ought to read that article. It's just a single article, and it's a great one. Once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. And you will agree that at the federal level, no bills are funded by taxes. Now, according to MMT, in Washington, the bills would be funded by taxes because Washington is not a currency sovereign that issues its own currency. So, going further, so James says it doesn't have to be, it can simply be funded. That's right. Eliminate the unnecessary tax burden, and you eliminate resistance to Medicare for all from people concerned about it. I'm aware of the bills out there, still not relevant to my comment. Well, they were relevant to some earlier comments, that you made, but this point is a good one. But of course, you do have to consider the possibility that, let's say that next year we got, to Medicare for all, and the appropriation was passed, and no offsetting taxes were passed. And assume the bill in the first year saved a considerable amount. I believe total healthcare spending in this country is approaching $3.9 trillion, very close to $4 trillion per year as we speak. So let's say the program was a great success even in its first transitional year, and that it saved $800 billion, in that year. That would mean the federal government would be spending $3.2 trillion without any offsetting taxes. Now, what are the implications of that for inflation, Jim? Yeah. We have to consider that. What are the implications of that? Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't do it that way. In fact, I think they should do it that way. I think the Medicare for All program should be funded by platinum coins, in perpetuity, so people don't have to worry about the unnecessary tax burden. I think if we're going to tax them, we should tell them the truth and say we're taxing them because some of them are too rich and are a threat to democracy for that reason, and we're taxing others because we have an inflationary situation we have to bring under control, and we're taxing still others because they're engaged in undesirable behavior, and we want to impose sin taxes on them. Yes, I believe in telling people the truth about why we're taxing them and what we're expecting to accomplish. And I agree with you that we are not expecting to pay for Medicare for all with taxes that we may levy to offset some of the Medicare for all spending. So Georgia says, I've talked to tens of thousands of voters. If you try to tell them healthcare will be free, at best, many will be skeptical. At worst, they'll call you stupid. I even gave it a test run yesterday with my parents. My dad, who was an economist, called the idea preposterous. Georgia, I have a suggestion for you. Tell your dad that the Medicare for All system will be free at the point of service and will save a bunch of dollars. But don't tell him, it'll be free. If he still says that idea is preposterous, then ask him how much they pay, in the UK at the point of service for the service they get. Ask them how much they pay in Denmark at the point of service for the service they get. Ask him how much they spend in Sweden at the point of service for the service they get. Because other countries are doing it. People are not paying service fees. They're not paying co-pays. They're not paying deductibles. In some countries, they're not even paying premiums. Now, of course, people are paying taxes for it, or they're being told that they're paying taxes to fund the spending. In some countries, those taxes are not funding the spending, they're just offsetting the spending. Jim says, it's not preposterous. It's that your dad doesn't know MMT. If he's open-minded and on board, he would likely come around like others have. We are aware of the challenges. We're also aware of the risks of doing this at the state level. Jim, I think there are risks at the state level. What you're saying about that is perfectly reasonable. There are risks in life. We can't escape from risks. Risks that Medicare will fail at the state level are greater the smaller the pool of patients in any state. If you've got a pool of 38 or 39 or 40 million potential patients in your state, the risk, as the private insurance companies know, is spread a lot more than if you've only got 600,000 people in your state or 1 million people in your state. Then, if your state has a particularly unfortunate year with respect to illness, perhaps you could exhaust the available money for the healthcare program. It could happen in Vermont. It could happen probably in Delaware. It could happen in Wyoming, perhaps. It could happen, in Idaho. There are probably enough people in Washington that it's very unlikely to happen in Washington. And if Washington united with Oregon and California and did a regional Medicare for all thingy, it probably could be funded by state taxes. I mean, a pool of 50 million people or 55 million people? Hell, how many people they have in France? 66 million people? How many people they have in Spain? Might be 55 million people in Spain. Might be 45 million people in Spain. Haven't checked the population of Spain lately. But the population of the 3 West Coast states, in the United States, I'm pretty sure exceeds the population of Spain.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Georgia says, it takes a lot of education. You lose voters. You've even lost allies on this thread because your talking points are unclear or negative. I got to say, my MMT friends, and you know you are my MMT friends, everyone who's participated in this thread is an MMT friend of mine. But I have to say that Georgia, is right. Your talking points are unclear because they're not couched in the detail they need to be couched in if they're going to be critical of the whole Washington proposal. Georgia, on the other hand, the bill that Jim is supporting at the federal level, which is probably H.R. 1976 right now, is not going to be funded by taxes. Okay, it will be free at the point, okay, of service. Of course, there will be taxes. I mean, there are taxes for lots of things. Our income taxes go to all kinds of things. They go to the military. Some of it goes for education. Some goes for HUD, for housing assistance. Some goes for our energy program. A lot of money goes to HHS now. Probably a little more would go to HHS. So there are taxes used to offset all of this particular spending. As we say, the taxes do not fund the spending. And in that sense, the Medicare for All program will be free in the sense that taxes are not going to pay for it, but they are going to offset it. Georgia says it's fairly confusing even for someone who knew a bit of MMT already. So Georgia, it's not really confusing when you think about it. Let's take where the Treasury's money comes from. You know where it comes from. It comes from the Federal Reserve Bank. It's the Federal Reserve that tops up the Treasury General Account, which is the Treasury spending account, okay, at the New York Fed, that takes care of most of the federal spending, okay, that we see. The money in that account is topped up with reserves created by the Federal Reserve. Each time it tops up that account. It's not topped up with tax money. The tax money is destroyed in the Federal Reserve settlement process. That's just a truth concerning how the Federal Reserve actually operates. So, the process of spending is logically separate from the process of taxing at the federal level. And the functions of both are separate from each other. The function of spending is to provide benefits for people, services. The function of taxing is to withdraw money from the economy to tamp down a demand. That is at least one of the functions of taxing. There are other functions of taxing too, but there is no function of taxing at the federal level in relation to actually paying for spending. The way the Medicare for All program at the federal level would be paid for would be through the Treasury sending wires, sometimes checks, but mostly wires to the recipients of Medicare for All spending. That's the way it's paid for each time. Well, you might ask the question, how does the Treasury get that money it uses to spend? The answer is it gets it from the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, of course, the funding of this spending is appropriated by the Congress. But the Congress doesn't automatically create the reserves that are to go into the Treasury spending account. No, the reserves are created by the Federal Reserve Bank in the Treasury spending account. After certain trigger events take place, the business rules of the Federal Reserve cause the Fed to top up the Treasury spending account. These business rules are related to taxing in many instances. They are related to sales of Treasury securities, as well. But these don't finance federal spending. What actually finances it is the appropriation of Congress in basically appropriating the funding in the first place, and the actions by the Fed in creating the reserves in the Treasury spending account. Now, that's not really so confusing, is it? Jim says, continuing on a false narrative that taxes fund spending, that we must offset spending with dollar-for-dollar taxes or cuts in other areas, that we're broke, etc., is the barrier to why we haven't progressed. We can't sustain that. But Medicare for All is one of a number of solutions needed. Jim, I completely agree with you on that, but you're talking on the national level. You're not talking on the state level. If whole Washington wants to put through a program in Washington, then it is stuck with the true narrative that state taxes in Washington fund spending. It has to deal in that arena. Now, the federal government can give Washington greater policy space. I hope it does. It can make grants to Washington. It can have revenue sharing programs with Washington, and other states. It can create greater policy space because the federal government is the monetary sovereign. But if it's Washington alone that's going to support this program or create this program without federal help, then it's going to have to be funded by taxes, or it's going to have to be funded by bonds that the state of Washington sells, because those are the mechanisms that Washington has to use. Now, things might be more flexible for Washington if, as part of the whole Washington plan, if Washington were to create a state bank like the Bank, of North Dakota, this might introduce a greater amount of flexibility into Washington's ability to fund not only Medicare for All, but a lot of other projects. This would be a good thing for Washington to do, I think. But for the lion's share of the program, that's going to have to be produced by tax revenues. Jim says, it is, always has been, and that's partially by design. However, infighting is also a huge barrier, I agree. Understand your goal, what your strategy is modeled on. We're concerned about the risks that come with the strategy. That's a clear statement. But there are people within a certain state who are willing to take those risks with their governmental unit. You can object and say, the risk you're taking is too great for the rest of us because you might fail. But we have a federal system. For better or worse, we have a federal system in this country. If we don't want Washington to fail, we should see to it that they get the increased policy space they need in order to be successful. That's what we should do. But our various states are free to provide for their own health, education, and welfare. These have been traditional state functions for as long as the Republic has been in place. If the people of one state want to make their own life better by instituting a Medicare for All program, we can say we're concerned about the risks that come with that strategy for the program we want to nationally pass. I mean, you might be concerned about those risks, but that can't be enough to persuade the people of Washington to go without a Medicare for All program that they otherwise might have had. I mean, your risks may not even be a likelihood with respect to the state of Washington. The risk of failure there may be relatively low likelihood, Jim. Georgia says, I'm fine with concern, but I assure you we know what we're doing with our strategy, and we've studied successful systems of expanding healthcare both abroad and here in the States. I think if you read back through our responses, you'd see that. I think, obviously, you know a lot about Medicare for All. No, Jim, this book, I love the deficit myth. And I love Stephanie. She's one of my favorite people, really. And the brilliance of her clear statements concerning MMT is a wonderful help to get our ideas implemented at the state level. But Stephanie Kelton is not an expert about the prospects for Medicare for All at the state level, and her book doesn't speak to that in the form of a coherent argument. And neither does MMT in general. You have to speak to that. MMT's contribution about that is this: is that states do not have the policy space that the monetary sovereign that is the United States has. They have much less policy space because they are not the currency issuers. We all understand that. And I suspect that everybody in the whole Washington movement probably agrees that that is true and probably regrets it. But what would you have Washington do? Would you have them secede from the Union so they could become a monetary sovereign, so they could have the flexibility to pass a Medicare for All program for their state? Or would you rather see them try a Medicare for All program for their state, including the limitations of having less policy space? I'd personally rather take the second risk than the first. I wouldn't want Washington to secede from the Union and reclaim their monetary sovereignty. Why would I want them to do that? I like Washington being in the Union. They're one of the most congenial states in the Union from the standpoint of my values. I'd much rather see Mississippi secede from the Union than Washington. Well, I'm not gonna go into which states I prefer and which states I don't. But you have to understand, the people of Washington, many people in Washington, want Medicare for All. If they can't have a national Medicare for All program, they want a state-based program. That's what they want. And they have every right to pursue it. And if you think the risk is too great, what you should be doing is working at the national level to get them revenue sharing funds so that program can't possibly fail. Because you know that if the proper amount of funding is available, we all agree. You and the Red Berets and everybody here on this thread agrees that if it's funded adequately, it will not fail. It will succeed. It will be wonderful for people. We all agree on that. So I don't think that MMT people looking at the possibility of a national program should say to the Washington people, you're hurting our chances of getting a national program by working for a state level program in your state. I don't really think we who live in other states have the right to say that to them. What we have the right to do is to back them up and to tell them that we'll do everything we can to back them up so that they can handle the costs of a Medicare for All program. Because we want it to be a success in Washington if they go ahead with it. We want it to be a success in Oregon if they go ahead with it. We want it to be a success in Pennsylvania if they go ahead with it. We want it to be a success in Minnesota if they go ahead with it. We want it to be a success in New York if they go ahead with it. Because that will maximize the chances that all the states go ahead with it and that we get Medicare for All nationwide. Red Beret says, in layman terms, we have a corporately owned president and a Congress that is deep in the pockets of the insurance lobby and big pharma. What this means to me is you want to recommend Stephanie Kelton's book to people who are fighting for human lives. You don't undermine us. And I got to agree with this. But I also want to say to Red Berets, take the time to read Stephanie Kelton's book. It's a wonderful book. It will help you in your desire to support a national Medicare for All program. I know you're in back of a national Medicare for All program. Book. There isn't a more important book in economics today for the general public. I mean, the MMT textbook by Randy Ray and Bill Mitchell and Martin Watts, that may be a more important book. But that's for people who want to get into the weeds, okay, of MMT. If you're looking for a well-rounded introduction to MMT, for the layman, Stephanie Kelton's book is the book. And everybody should read it so that people who are looking at the nation as a whole understand the lies they tell us concerning how things are funded at the federal level. Jim says, that's not macro in layman's terms. The corporate state problems exist at state, local, and federal levels. Fighting for human lives includes and goes far beyond Medicare for All. I'm sharing so people can understand what's possible and what the actual constraints are. We all want Medicare for All or a true national health service. Jim, you're absolutely right. And Red Beret says, I'm fighting for Medicare for All or NHS style reform as well. I lived in the UK for 7.5 years. Why else would I have organized tons of events for Bernie's campaign and supported Medicare for All candidates and movement leaders with my handcrafting? The issue is the timeline. Yep, the issue is the timeline, and the issue is the needs of the people of Washington. If Washington has the capability to pass Medicare for all, they need to do it because it would immediately save the lives of Washingtonians that will not be saved by the fooling around going on at the federal level right now. And it's incumbent on us to support their efforts in the state of Washington, because that will make it that much easier to pass a national Medicare for all program where the monetary sovereign has the flexibility to fund that program with overt congressional financing if it wants to, or with trillion-dollar platinum coins if it wants to. Okay, or just with simple orders from the Congress, okay, if it wants to. And Red Beret says, I do not know a single at-hole Washington volunteer who would not rather pass this nationally. Like yesterday, we've organized for it, donated for it, knit and crocheted for it. We will still do every day. If a movement leader wants to seriously take on this fight now, we're in. So where are you, Ocasio-Cortez? Why did you and the other members of the squad not defeat Nancy Pelosi's run for the speakership on January 3rd of this year and get someone in there as speaker who was more friendly to Medicare for all? Why didn't you do this? People were waiting for you to do this. Instead, you folded for a few crumbs. Red Beret says, I'll be happy to read at Stephanie Kelton's book on MMT, and I will hope in return that existing proponents of the economic theory cease and desist on demanding two grassroots organizations who do an incredible amount of organizing on a national front. Solidarity is the key. I got to agree with that. Solidarity is the key. Amber Lee Grigo says, I'm sorry that some folks in the MMT community can be aggressive at times, although they mean well. Please know that many of us are here to support and learn from one another. I hope it doesn't leave a bad taste in your mouth. Hashtag MMT, hashtag MMT Truth, hashtag Whole Washington. That's great, Amber. And incremental changes for the privileged few says, I don't think abrasiveness was one-sided. Been watching all the chats, comments from all have been mixed, sound remarks, and personal attacks use as arguments. Yes, be mindful of people undermining the collective effort to unite us via issues with knowledge. Amber says, I think whole Washington people are really great people, and I think the MMT community is really, really great people too. I think they could work together, and I applaud and encourage any efforts towards that end, full stop. Amber, this is an effort toward that end. Obviously, my effort is towards that end. Georgia says, here for that, 100 would love for the opportunity to be in a coalition rather than trying to search for flaws in the bill instead, okay, of all the benefits. Oh, by the way, Georgia, or George, actually, it's George, actually. We should search for flaws in your bill. Not because of some weird notion that MMT, okay, is against your bill, because MMT is not against your bill. MMT is, it's a lens. It's not about your specific bill. It has an important thing to say about your specific bill in terms of policy space. It can be said in just a few sentences. It doesn't need really more than that. Other than that, there are the particulars of your state and what you can do in your state. But apart from that, you might have some flaws in your bill. If we point out those flaws, you can correct them. It can only strengthen your bill, us being able to criticize it. Okay? And now here's Jules. A coalition would be fantastic if we all work cooperatively for universal single payer. But people understand that state-based Medicare for all is detrimental to the national push, shouldn't be made out to be demons for standing by that economic truth. I don't know who's saying that you're a demon, Jules, but what has to be said is that state-based Medicare for all, if successful, may not be detrimental to the national push. I know Canada is not the United States. I'm very well aware of that, and I find Margaret Flower's arguments about that to be very important arguments that everybody should listen to very, very seriously. But they do not determine that state-based efforts are going to fail. And if they succeeded in Washington, if they succeeded in Oregon, if they succeeded in California, if they succeeded in New York, if they succeeded in Pennsylvania, if they succeeded, in Minnesota, that would be a real help to the national push for Medicare for all. And the more of those states that were successful at once, the stronger the push would be for a national Medicare for all bill. I don't know whether that's an economic truth or not, Jules, but I know that's a political truth. And the political truth here actually dominates. It's not that you're standing by some economic truth, but people who understand that state-based M4A is necessarily detrimental to the national push are not uttering an economic truth. They're uttering a political truth. And as it happens, it's not a truth, it's an untruth politically. That's the point. Or let me put it more softly. It may be an untruth. It is not a guaranteed truth. I know you think it's a guaranteed truth, but in making that pronouncement, you've departed from MMT into politics. And MMT is not politics, it is economics. And even if you say that what MMT is political economy, I'll accept that. But I'll also point out that it's the economic framework inside, of MMT that is the strong part, of MMT. The political part of MMT is much more arguable. Now, of course, there are many MMTers who will say, there's no political part, of MMT. It's all an economic framework. From the beginning, I've always thought that was bullshit. And I still think it's bullshit. All economists make what are essentially political commitments in their selection of categories and their selection of conjectures and their selection of relevant tests. Every time they do a selection, they're making a decision, and values come into every decision that they make, and some of those values are political. That's the truth of the matter, Jules. If MMT is political economy, then MMT is suffused with values and with political judgments. And if you think it's only economics, then you shouldn't be making political pronouncements about what they should do in the state of Washington, Jules. And Red Berets talked about looking at either a mute or a block for you. If you were doing a mute, okay, or a block for Jules, but you wouldn't have had this whole discussion. And this whole discussion has been a very valuable discussion, I think. I think it has illuminated the contact points between MMT and what you're doing in Washington. That's a valuable function. And I'm glad that it happened. Georgia says, you know what's interesting? You hopped onto a thread about a single-payer author that had zero to do with MMT to criticize other Medicare for All organizers. You and your MMT cohorts are the annoyance. I was sympathetic to MMT before, but after this whole experience, I'm done. I'm sorry, George. Please don't be done. There are all kinds of valuable things for you in MMT. Particularly the MMT lens can be applied in a very useful way if you want to organize public banks and get them backed by the Federal Reserve. It can be very useful to your point of view if you want to find ways to fund the revenue sharing programs with the states that have to be passed at the national level. Then MMT views on monetary sovereignty can be very useful to your arguments. So maybe some MMT cohorts here were an annoyance to you. I'm sure they were not intending to be an annoyance to you. But the fact is, MMT knowledge is far more than an annoyance, and you should have some. And you should probably start with Steph's book. It's great. And Amber Lee says, love and solidarity from the Tri-Cities. There are plenty of other places and people to get MMT info from without being browbeat. I feel awful that this has happened. Tommy says, no offense to anyone, but I hope folks are willing to learn MMT for one says something has zero to do with MMT, because for policies needing funding, MMT explains that process. If you know what I mean, there are many smooth sources for learning MMT, like the deficit myth. I completely agree, Tommy. And Red Beret says, I've just tweeted. You'll see it. There's always tomorrow. Okay. So that's the thread I wanted to go through with you. I think it was a very useful thread. Very valuable to see the back and forths. Very valuable to understand that the particularities of the state level situation are very important. And very important also to understand that the MMT point that states have less policy space, okay, than the national government is absolutely correct. But that doesn't doom state level programs to failure. And that doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that state-based programs have to detract from the national push for Medicare for All. You can't coerce people into supporting the particular movement that you favor. People from Washington, the whole Washington movement, sees an opportunity in Washington to get Medicare for All for their people, to save many, many thousands of people and make life better for Washingtonians. As citizens of Washington, as well as the United States, they have a right to pursue this. And we should be completely in back of them. Okay? that is my message for tonight. I also want to do is, I meant to cover, I still haven't covered, one more article that is negative, uh, that might be called a negative response to the state-based idea. I think it's important to hear that and to analyze it. It's important to know that the revenue sharing idea has support in Washington. There's a support for a revival of that idea. And if that is revived, then the MMT knowledge at the federal level can be very valuable for advocates from the states, from all the states, to descend on Washington and have that monetary sovereignty used for the benefit of the states and the citizens of the states, as well as for the benefit of the citizens of the whole country. Which, as you know, there's considerable overlap between the two. Nor would this topic be exhausted without going through Ro Khanna's bill for state-based Medicare for all. And I still want to go over that. And I still want to go over something recent that happened with the parliamentarian in the Senate trying to screw up certain things again. And the reason why that's relevant to this whole thing is because right now, unless we get rid of the filibuster, what bills we're going to be able to pass in Washington will probably be reconciliation bills. And she had more to say when it comes to reconciliation, and it's not a hopeful sign, and we got to mobilize, against that, and it affects possible federal help for the whole Washington effort. So it's important to that. So I want to come back and discuss those things tomorrow, now that I'm through with the thread, that I wanted to get through with. And so I'll see you tomorrow for that. But now, of course, I'm going to come back to your comments. Hope to have my camera software fixed by tomorrow also. So, Solana says, howdy, and Ghost Start is here. Amber's here. And Steve says, hi, Veronica, como ecstasy. And he says, como estás? And Steve says, so Newsom has a new proposal. Well, California helps first-time homeowners by becoming your partner. They would basically own half your home, but at least you'd get in. Yeah, it might be a good proposal. Kay says, do you think that is a good thing, Steve Wolfbrand? As long as you can sell your half whenever you want to, seems like it might be good. And Steve says, Rendon shot down our Medicare for all vote here in California, that bastard. Steve Wolfbrand says, maybe. And Kay says, laugh out loud. And maybe is a good answer. Steve said, I think if we united 4 or 5 Western states, we could make a good run for regional Medicare for all. Yeah, I do too, Steve. I've been for that for a long time. But I think you could probably do it with 3 Western states, that I mentioned. Maybe Nevada would be interested in joining the coalition. And maybe Arizona. I don't know about Idaho, though. I don't know whether Utah would be willing to come aboard. But there we are. Yeah, I think you can make a good run for Medicare for all. You might get, Nevada, and Arizona. That gets you to 5 states, doesn't it? Steve Day says, exclamation point. Steve Wolfbrand says, it's basically impossible for young first-time buyers to get a house here, Kay. Kay says, I understand that, Steve Wolfbrandt, getting to be like that everywhere now. My first home was in a low-income neighborhood here in Ohio. Now those are going for over 100,000. Shake my head. Yes, our first home was in Buffalo, New York, and if I recall correctly, we bought it for 23,000. It wasn't actually in Buffalo; it was in the town of Tonawanda,
Yeah.
which is a suburb, of Buffalo. And we bought that for 23,000. We wonder what it goes for today. Yeah, but we didn't buy anything in Cheektowaga.
Right.
I just lived in Cheektowaga for a while. Kay says, some days in that low income hood, we couldn't even go outside because of the pollution from a nearby Ashland oil refinery. Cars and everything were covered in ash. Steve says, well, normal hour houses here go for about 800,000. Okay, that's in LA, right? It's not far different here in Ashburn, which is a suburb of DC. I guess the normal houses here, if they're detached houses, they're probably going for 700,000 or 800,000. I think some of the townhouses are going for 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 a year.
A lot of very wealthy people living here.
Yes, this area of Loudoun County in the United States have a lot of very well-off people, and even some super wealthy people. But I think it's mostly a lot of contract workers for the federal government, two-income families with substantial incomes from both of the partners. And of course, they can afford to buy fairly expensive houses, especially the older they get. Kay says, I know, but I'm talking Ohio, the crappy GOP ruined state. People here can't afford 100,000. Steve says the Japanese government is looking for people to occupy some 8 million empty homes. The local authorities are giving away free houses and renovation subsidies to incentivize moving. The problem of empty houses in rural areas is not unique to Japan. The program not only helps the old owners who are struggling to utilize the properties and pay taxes, but also for a town by reducing the number of abandoned buildings. A spokesman for the Okutama government office told Nikkei. And there's a link kindly left by Steve Gonzo for us. Thank you, Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says there are some countries that will help you move to their small towns to replace young residents who are moving to bigger cities for more opportunities. Yeah, that's true. Kay said, I had a friend in North Carolina who lived most of his life in the UK. He told me taxes there were a little higher, but you got good things for your tax money. People in Sweden feel the same way. Kay says, I had an online friend from the UK who was in the health service there. She said, when the country pays for your health care, they try harder to keep you healthy instead of our sick care that makes more money keep you sick, right? Kay says she was an RN. Kay says it's not so damn confusing either, like sick care. I know it's not confusing, they just treat you. He says, who exactly is Joe talking to? I'm talking both to the whole Washington movement that was active in that thread and to some of the MMTers who took it upon themselves to walk into the whole Washington thread and to start to critique what the people there were saying, because Washington is not a monetary sovereign, and therefore there's a greater risk of financial problems if they have a Medicare for All program. However, the question is not whether there's a greater risk of that. The question is whether the risk is so great that the program is extremely likely to fail. I really doubt that for the state of Washington. It's got an appreciable population. It has very good technical expertise in that state. They've probably designed a very, very good bill based on the federal bills, and they have people who will administer it extremely well in Washington as well. Uh, and Gerald Friedman is probably close to right when he says they can save from $5 to $9 billion every year if they develop a Medicare for all program, and that they can serve most all the people of Washington with such a program. So I'm really talking to all those people, and I regret that MMTers descended on that particular thread. I regret that. Kay said, "We see, in doing it in that way, what they ended up doing is not helping the national Medicare for All movement, not helping the national movement, okay, for MMT, but just dividing people who normally would be allies." Kay says, "We need single payer, whatever you call it. It will free people to move wherever they want to or have to go for jobs." Kay says, "SCOTUS is now deliberating on killing Obamacare, quote unquote. If they do that, we may have no choice but to go for Medicare for all." Yeah. Evelina says, "Is this how they get money for military spending as well?" I'm thinking yes. Evelina says, "I'm," and Kay says, "Hi, Evelina Pont," and Evelina says, "Hey, Kay." And Steve Wolfbrand says, "I'm waiting for the government, the UFO report. Hopefully this all becomes a moot point, but probably not." And Evelina says, "They're up to something." Shake my head. Steve says, "Love the red berets." Yeah, I do too. Steve Gonzo says, hashtag TDMP. What's TDM? To be, no, I don't know what TDM is. You'll tell me though, Steve. Kay says the 7 eastern counties in Oregon want to join to the state to the east of them now. Doubt that will happen, but it makes you think. If the 7 eastern counties want to join to the state to the east of them, which is probably Wyoming, Idaho, I'm not sure. But if they want to, why don't they let them do it? I mean, that state's hopeless. I'm not talking about Oregon. I'm talking about the state to the east of them. Steve Wolfbrand says, "TYT and the Hill have abandoned us. I've unsubscribed to both. You should too." Well, you should see what the Hill has to say. I mean, I know that the Crystal and Sagar uh, have gone to where the grass is greener, and that's wonderful. I'm glad, okay, they have. But, the way I see it is we might get some good commentary out of Rising on the Hill, and we know we're going to get good commentary out of the Breakpoints program. So we might actually gain from this split. Let's not be too hasty to dismiss the Hill. As far as TYT is concerned, I think they're a lost cause. I think they've been turning into a bunch of cruds for a long time now. Evelina Pont says, "Stephanie Kelton's book for the general public because it's in plain English." Steve says, "I had one of those platinum coins, but it got lost on the sofa cushions." Kevin St. Ford is probably laughing at that. Hiya, Kevin. And Kay says, the Progressive Democrats of America is doing their best to push single payer in California. Good for PDA. Kevin St. Ford says, "Thanks for weighing in on this, Joe." And Steve says, "What is PDA? Progressive Dems of America." And Evelina says, "TYT did, but why do you say the Hill did too?" Steve Wolfbrand said, "The Hill threw Crystal and Saga under the bus. They've left, replaced by boring hosts." Well, I'm not sure the hosts are going to be boring for good. I think Emily Dershinsky is pretty smart and not the average kind of rightist jerk at all. And I think Ryan Grimm is pretty smart too, and I know that at critical points he seems to be selling us out, but he's still capable of good commentary that can be helpful to us. And they were regulars on Crystal and Sagar's show, so they couldn't have been that boring. So let's see what they can do when they're given the responsibility to add to that show. Let's see what they produce. It's worth looking at for a while and seeing what's going on. There's no need to give any money to them. You can still give the money to Crystal and Sagar. They'll need it now. Kay says, Steve Wolfbrand, Sundays at 4 p.m. my time. I always share PDA Town Hall. Check it out. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrand, where are Crystal and Sagar now? They're trying a new show of their own called Breaking Points, Evelina Pont. Yes, they've already produced a few videos, and next week they should be there in force. At Avenger Clitoris. I don't know who that is. Steve Gonzo says, even if Democrats had 65 senators, they still wouldn't pass progressive policies. It depends on who the 65 senators were, doesn't it? I mean, if we could pick up 15 more progressive Democratic senators, maybe they get much closer to passing progressive policies, right? How about getting 15 more Bernie Sanders? I mean, maybe we can even get somebody to the left of Bernie Sanders. Kay says, sad but true, Steve Gonzo. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Crystal and Sagar have gone independent. The show is called Breaking Points, will be available in a couple of days. Yes. Evelina says, do you know where? Good point, Kay. The clips will be on YouTube, Evelina. Yes, they will. And I think they're going to be on Patreon also. And Evelina says, National Health tries harder to keep you healthy. They do in the UK. Steve says, strangely, there's a phenomenon in Japan. The people just disappear. Suicides, they don't want to bother their families. Kind of sad. For a while, people were disappearing that way in Russia. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union and the victory of neoliberalism, in Japan, the austerity programs and all that, so many people became unemployed. Alcoholism got to be a terrible problem, and it often ended, in suicide. It's possible that Russia lost 30 million people to that transition. People did begin just to disappear. Kevin said, I joined that thread to support old Washington because of your show last night. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, I got to look up your tweets on that because they're probably in threads that I haven't seen yet, and they might be very interesting to take a look at. Evelina says, Japanese culture has that about it I don't like. Steve says, but the Red Berets knit their own berets. I love it. Yeah, Laura. Kevin says, check out Kyle's Secular Talk video on the shady things the hell did to Crystal and Sarah. Yeah, I did see that today. Kevin says, I can't continue to subscribe anymore in solidarity. Hashtag TDM, the deficit myth. Oh, thank you, Steve. By the way, I don't regret us jumping into the Medicare for All thread because we have Joe to bring us back to common ground. Thank you, Steve. And Evelina says, breaking points. Thank you. And you're very welcome, Evelina. Okay, folks, I guess that brings us to the end once again. I hope a very happy ending. I'll be back tomorrow with part 3. When I started this week, I didn't intend to do 3 parts on this, but as I get more and more into it, I think it's well worth it. Evelina says, neoliberalism kills. It sure does, and it sucks also. And austerity kills too. We can lose some people in a transition to democratic socialism, but maybe they'll go to Mars. Dolores says, thank you for a great discussion. Thank you, Dolores. I really did enjoy discussing this. It was worthwhile discussing this. Now, both Jim Nicola, okay, and Tommy, okay, I consider friends, and really fairly good friends too. They're very friendly to me. Okay, in the past, and we've supported each other very much. Okay, in the past, and I think you saw that when I criticized them, it was certainly okay in a friendly way. I tried to be fair, and I tried to see both sides. Okay, of the discussion. Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. Okay, I love you all. Okay, I wasn't so friendly to Jules because he and I haven't had, that much exchange. I respect his point of view, certainly, but I think he's claiming that certain judgments he's making, which are not economic judgments, are economic judgments dictated by the MMT paradigm. That is false. Absolutely false. And it makes me mad that he would try that play, I have to say. Thank you for coming again. And Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. I love you all. And we do love you, Kay. So good night. I'll see you again on Saturday night. We'll go cavorting on Saturday night.